Well, I want to share a few thoughts with you about oil particularly and what we need to do in order to break the power of those who dominate it. First, a few facts. About 80% of the world's reserves of conventional oil, not things like Canadian tar sands, but conventional oil are in the hands of OPEC. Petroleum products absolutely dominate transportation. 95, 96% of the transportation in the world is fueled by some derivative of petroleum. We borrow about $1 billion a day to import oil. 360, 370 billion a year at today's price of oil. If oil goes up to $125 a barrel, where it was a couple of years ago, it was higher, it got up in the 140s, but if it should get to 125 billion, at that point, approximately half the wealth in the world is in the hands of OPEC, in the form of sovereign wealth funds, in the form of resources of wealthy individuals, in the form of oil in the ground. And as the price of oil goes up, as I'm sure you know, the amount that can be exploited goes up, so it grows, and that's why at $125 a barrel, OPEC is so wealthy. Saudi Arabia alone earns something in the ballpark of $1 trillion a year from oil, hundreds of billions from us. But the pattern of trade for oil doesn't matter that much. If we stopped buying from the Middle East and really went to town with our Mexican and Canadian neighbors and said we want to import everything from you and Norway, then other people would just change the pattern of what they buy. Other people would buy more from Saudi Arabia, and not much would change. So you don't change anything particular by changing the pattern of your oil imports. A lot of people are worried about foreign dependence, and so they start their speeches with foreign dependence on oil is a terrible thing, our dependence on foreign oil. And then they stick at the bottom of the speech their favorite thing they want to do: build nuclear power plants, have a cap and trade system, drill locally. In between the foreign oil is a problem and the solution, there frequently is no particular connection. Let's take nuclear power plants. It is important for us to produce electricity cleanly for all sorts of reasons. We know how to build nuclear reactors. This may be one path that we want to pursue in order to produce electricity cleanly. But that has nothing to do, for all practical purposes, with oil. Less than 2% of our electricity comes from oil. Back in the 1970s, it was different. It was about 20%. So in the 1970s, if you built a nuclear power plant, you might well be replacing an oil-fired power plant, and then you were doing something about foreign oil dependence. Today, you're not. 98+%, you're not. But you say maybe some of these things you talk about, like electric cars, we're going to need new power plants in the future, right? In order to power electric cars? No. 3 major studies from the Electric Power Research Institute, the utilities, from Natural Resources Defense Council, environmental, from Pacific Northwest National Laboratories, all say the same thing. You could have something like 2/3 of the cars on the road be powered by electricity before you need a single new power plant. It's because the grid at night is so underutilized. It's utilized to the tune of about 20-25%. So what you do is incentivize people to plug in their cars overnight. So, for all practical purposes, electricity and how you produce it is a separate set of issues. It's an important energy set of issues. And maybe you like renewables, maybe like me, you like renewables and natural gas, maybe you like nuclear power. Interesting debate. Has almost nothing to do with oil. How about cap and trade? A lot of statements from the administration start with dependence on foreign oil is awful, so let's have a cap and trade system. Cap and trade is one mechanism for penalizing carbon and getting people to move away from utilizing high carbon fuels like coal to produce electricity. Reasonable difference of opinion about whether it's too bureaucratic, whether it depends on how you do it, etc. But cap and trade is about fixed sources, not mobile ones. $1 a ton of CO2 in a cap and trade system is 1 penny per gallon at the pump. If you had a cap and trade system such as is essentially included in the House of Representatives bill and had about a $25 a ton cost or price put on carbon dioxide, that would add about 25 cents a gallon to the price of gasoline. You may like cap and trade, you may think it's a good idea because of climate change or whatever. It has virtually nothing to do with oil dependence. You may be a baby drill person. If we could just produce domestically, stop all this nonsense. Yeah, we'll get it fixed. We'll figure out how to drill without causing gushers underwater in the Gulf of Mexico and spills in Alaska and the rest. Well, okay, you do a little something by producing more domestically. That $1 billion a day we borrow to import oil, if we really worked hard and replaced 10% of that with domestic production, then we'd only be borrowing $900 million a day. There'd be a few more jobs here. It'd help our balance of payments a bit. Would it change fundamentally our dependence? Not appreciably at all. The reason is that OPEC is the low-cost producer and they have the reserves. So historically what has happened is that once they got that power, such as in the 1970s, when they wanted to drive competitors out of business, they'd do what John D. Rockefeller used to do. They'd drop the price, crash the, we had the Synfuels Corporation, synthetic fuel made from coal back in the late 70s, early 80s. OPEC bankrupted that operation in 1985 by dropping the price of oil down to about $5 a barrel. OPEC probably doesn't have the flexibility to do that nearly as much as it used to, but it still, for all practical purposes, sets the world price of oil. Oil is not part of a free market economy in any fundamental sense. It is part of operated by a cartel that fixes prices to maximize its own income and has a monopoly on transportation and a near monopoly on oil. So, if that states our problem, what are some of the consequences of our borrowing $1 billion a day and the world consuming over $1 trillion worth of a year of oil? Well, there's several. First of all, Professor Paul Collier at Oxford at St. Anthony's heads the Institute for African Economics, is the principal author of a theory that Tom Friedman stated very well in his book Hot, Flat, and Crowded. There's a chapter in there called Fill Her Up with Dictators. And what Tom means, and what Collier has written in a very scholarly fashion about, is the fact that whenever you have a commodity that has a huge amount of economic rent attached to it, that is, income well over and above what would be an ordinary or reasonable return on capital and labor. For example, this costs the Saudis $3 or $4 a barrel to lift oil in the Gulf. They're now selling it for what, 80, 75, 80? That's a lot of economic rent. So when you have a commodity with a huge amount of economic rent, and it comes into a society that is already run as a dictatorship or an autocratic kingdom, it tends to enhance the power of those who have access to the rent. It tends to make them more autocratic. With Mr. Putin, you can almost do it by the month. When oil is up, that's a good time to invade someplace or hack someplace like Estonia. When oil drops, he gets a little more reasonable. But normally the tie isn't quite that close, but there is a long-term institutional development of this sort. Now, it does not mean that if you have a broadly based economy, democracy, Canada, Norway, that you discover a lot of oil and you become a dictatorship. No, we haven't seen that. Because you already have a broadly based economy and you already have a democracy. But if you are a dictatorship or an autocracy and you get access to a lot of oil, it's pretty interesting. 8 of the 9 largest oil exporting countries in the world are dictatorships or autocratic kingdoms. Only nice Norway is out of place in there. You say, what about Canada? Canada's 10th, so either 8 out of 9 or 8 out of 10 are dictatorships or autocratic kingdoms. Larry Diamond of the Hoover Institution at Stanford has just written last year a very fine book on democracy and its impact on economics and political movements and the like. Larry says that if you take the 22 countries in the world for whom oil is 2/3 or more of their national income, there are 22 such countries, every one of them is a dictatorship or autocratic kingdom. It means that when we are funding oil, as Tom Friedman put it, we are filling up with dictators. Now, what are some of the consequences of that? Well, Lawrence Wright writes often for the New Yorker, wrote what I think is a very fine book about Al-Qaeda and 9/11 called The Looming Tower about 4 or 5 years ago. Wright says in there that with between 1% and 2% of the world's Muslims, the Saudis control about 90% of the world's Islamic institutions, including mosques and schools. What does that mean? This is one of the most autocratic nations in the world. If you're a woman, I suppose it is the most autocratic nation in the world. And the consequences of all that economic rent enhancing the power of the ruling elite in Saudi Arabia and their sect of Islam, Wahhabism, is pretty dramatic. As we've heard very effectively from Charles this morning, Wahhabi Islam, its main tenets are effectively somewhere between murderous and genocidal with respect to Shiite Muslims, Jews, homosexuals, and apostates, massively repressive of everyone else, including particularly women, and pointed toward either through military jihad or economic jihad or dawah, proselytization, to establishing a worldwide caliphate, a theocratic dictatorship. The one thing that is sort of interesting about the country just across the Gulf from Saudi Arabia, Iran, is that their historically ruling approach toward Islam, Shiite Islam, particularly Twelvers, believe that the hidden Imam, the 12th Imam, is going to return someday after having disappeared in the 9th century and lead the battles that end the world. Historically, Shiite Islam has generally not incorporated its religious leaders into government. More like Ayatollah Sistani in Iraq, they see themselves as more like ministers, rabbis, relatively rarely in Shiite history until Khomeini did the clerics dominate the government. Well, that changed when Khomeini came to power in '79. And that means that the ruling elite now in Iran is quite influenced by a particular sect of Islam, of Shiite Islam, of Twelver Shiite Islam, called the Hojatiyya. Now, I don't think this is very many Iranians, but the Revolutionary Guard sends its, Ahmadinejad makes sure that the Revolutionary Guard sends its leaders and quite a few people to this school in the holy city of Qum run by an Ayatollah named Mesbah Yazdi. So they get indoctrinated with the Hojatiyya beliefs. What are those beliefs? Well, it's difficult to make the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia look like moderates, but at least the Wahhabis still want the world to exist. The Hojatiyya believe not only that the hidden imam is going to return, but that they should work to get him to come back. And the way you do that is by dominating the Middle East and killing all the Jews. Sound familiar? Like another country maybe in the early 1930s? Anyway, it's like I said, it's hard to make the Wahhabis look like moderates, but at least they want the world to continue to exist. The Hojatiyya believe once they accomplish those two terrible tasks, then the Mahdi will return and lead the battles that end the world. It's a program, right? Therefore, when we buy oil products, who are we empowering and what ideologies are we empowering in the Middle East? We are empowering Wahhabi Islam and we are empowering the Hojatiyya. Now, one final point on the religious side. The substantive doctrine of the Wahhabis and that of Al-Qaeda are for all practical purposes the same. Murderous with respect to the groups I mentioned, terribly repressive of everybody else, work toward establishing a caliphate. Those doctrines are as substantively the same, just as Marxism-Leninism in its violent forms in the early part of the 20th century. There was virtually no substantive difference between the Stalinists and the Trotskyites. They both believed you want to have a dictatorship of the proletariat after you liquidate the bourgeoisie and the wealthy farmers. They substantively had no major disagreement. What the Trotskyites and Stalinists fight was about was power. Who was in charge? Do you have to obey Stalin, or do you get to go start revolutions wherever you want to, as Trotsky wanted to? Same, roughly, very roughly, idea with respect to Al-Qaeda and the House of Saud and the Wahhabis. The Al-Qaeda believes they ought to be able to fly airplanes into buildings whenever they want, regardless of what the Saudis say. And so their struggle with the House of Saud is about power, but it's not about substance. Look back to around 1970 when the Clean Air Act was passed and we decided to get the lead out because lead is highly toxic and carcinogenic. We had to have something to improve the octane of cars, otherwise your engine would knock and it wouldn't have any power. The Clean Air Act makes it possible for EPA to regulate very heavily something called aromatics, benzene, toluene, xylene, which have the characteristic of reducing engine knock, just as lead did. But those aromatics are also highly carcinogenic. If you have a fixed plant of some sort, a chemical plant, and you produce even a tiny bit of benzene, toluene, xylene that leaks out, you're in big trouble, heavily regulated. But EPA, for 40 years now, has given a pass to oil companies for putting benzene, toluene, xylene into gasoline, about a quarter of gasoline, even though those also are highly carcinogenic. There are alternatives for creating the octane one needs. Ethanol is one, esters of ethanol like ETBE or others. In time there will be others such as biobutanol and the like. But nobody has pushed hard on this because the oil companies have gotten such a free pass creating high octane while pumping carcinogens into all of our lungs. I think there's at least a chance that this may get some attention before long. Because if it does, you could conceivably see a rather substantial increase in use of biofuels and a reduction in use of carcinogenic additives like the aromatics. Would that be a bad thing from the point of view of food versus energy competition and the like? I don't think so. It's all relative, as some of the points Charles was making. Ethanol is certainly not the best fuel in the world, but if you compare it to petroleum products, it looks pretty good. First of all, we are not taking land out of production of food and putting it into growing corn for ethanol. The amount of land we've had in corn has steadily declined for the last 60 years, from 120 plus million acres down to about 80 million now, headed down. Corn yields have gone up by a factor of 6 in that time because of the Green Revolution, Norman Borlaug, all of that. But it's not because we're taking land away from corn on the cob and planting it in corn to grow ethanol. Also, 95% of the corn in the United States that is grown for any creature to consume is consumed by animals, not people. Corn on the cob is about 5% of corn. Most all of it is animal feed. And if you take corn and produce ethanol from it, you're only using the corn starch. The animals still get the protein, still get the oil, still get the nutrients. It's called dried distiller's grain, and it's one of the 2 products of an ethanol plant. What is the problem with using cornstarch to drive on instead of its other uses? Well, cornstarch has 2 principal other uses. Maybe you're fans of them, I'm not. One is that it is taken to consolidated animal feeding operations, CAFOs, big factory farms where the cattle don't graze on the range. They stay cooped up. The cornstarch is jammed down their throats. Cattle do not naturally eat cornstarch. It makes them terribly sick. They have to be given huge doses of antibiotics as well, and all of that has only one purpose, which is to make the meat fatter, therefore to produce cholesterol for you and me. The antibiotic use degrades the effectiveness of the antibiotics for other uses because resistance builds up in various bacterial strains. And if the cornstarch isn't used for that purpose, or to make ethanol and drive on it, there is one other use. You can make fructose out of it and make junk food a lot cheaper, thereby adding to the obesity epidemic among American children. So, to put it mildly, I think an evolution away from cancer-causing additives in gasoline toward more use of even ethanol, and for other biofuels will be considerably better in the years to come, is not a negative thing. What else might we do in order to move away from oil dependence? Improved standards for mileage help. Recently, the Bush administration added some. The Obama administration has implemented them. That will help us reduce gasoline use, and that's fine. Biofuels of the sort that I've described would help. But one thing that is coming, not as fast as I would like, but just about here now, is producing such biofuels from waste, from agricultural waste, particularly, and we have plenty of that. And that can be used to produce what's called drop-in fuels, like biobutanol, that can mix readily and completely with gasoline or diesel without separate pumps, without separate pipelines, without anything of that sort. Third is T. Boone Pickens. It's not a bad idea to drive on natural gas when you can. Big vehicles, trucks and delivery vehicles, fleet vehicles, can be converted relatively easily to drive on natural gas. And that lets you make some changes to existing vehicles. We are discovering a lot more natural gas in shale formations. It is extracted by a somewhat controversial process called hydrofracturing or fracking. which carries some risk of polluting groundwater, but technologically, I think those problems are basically solved. So we may be on the edge of having a lot more affordable natural gas than people thought just recently as a year or two ago, and converting diesel trucks that only need to be refueled at truck stops, or fleet vehicles like school buses that only need to be refueled overnight at a school bus barn, would not require putting in lots and lots more natural gas pipelines and the rest. And then electrification. I drive a Prius that's had a 5 kilowatt hour battery added to it, charge it overnight, about 4 or 5 hours for 50, 60 cents, and drive essentially all electric for the first 20 miles or so the next day. At the end of that 20 miles, the added juice in the battery from the overnight charge is up, and it just becomes a regular Prius. You don't have to find some place to plug in. It has tank gasoline. The Chevy Volt that will come out in the fall also has a somewhat larger battery, a bit more expensive, but it's not an all-electric car. You don't have to find a place to plug in. You can drive on liquid fuel if you want, but the cheapest and best way to do it is to drive the first 40 miles on overnight electricity, and then use the liquid fuel in the tank, and for the Volt, it will be ethanol as well as gasoline, to drive a generator, charge battery, continue to drive. So you don't have the inconvenience or the range anxiety, as people call it, that people have with all electric cars, where you got to worry about finding some place to plug in if you look like you're getting low on electricity. Average car in the US goes, 3/4 of them go less than 40 miles a day. So on 3 days out of 4, a car that goes 40 miles on overnight electricity is an all-electric car, on average. Steps of those sorts can, as a portfolio, not a single solution, help us move, I think, quite decisively away from petroleum products and toward alternatives, biofuels and electricity. And I think we can begin to see, over the course of the next decade, if we move out smartly on all of those, a world in which demand for petroleum products is headed down in the ballpark of being cut in half. That would begin to change everything. The world was a different place back when I was growing up in Oklahoma, and OPEC was the Texas Railway Commission. The Texas Railway Commission set the world price of of oil for all practical purposes. And it was a nice world. It was a world of 25 cents a gallon gasoline. Those days are gone with the wind. They will never return. Texas Railway Commission will never again be OPEC. OPEC is OPEC. And what we absolutely have to do in the interests of our own security, our own economic health, avoiding paying for both sides in this war on terror that we're involved in, avoiding giving ourselves cancer, for all of these reasons, we need to do to oil what was done almost inadvertently to salt at the end of the 19th century. My sometime writing colleague Annie Corinth thought up this analogy, and I'll close with it. In the late 1890s and the beginning of the 20th century, electric grids started to be prevalent in major cities in parts of the world. And people began to realize that the dominance that salt had for preserving meat was no more. Salt was a strategic commodity for thousands of years. The biblical phrase, "You're the salt of the earth," means you're important, not that you're cheap. The word salary comes from salt. Until the 1890s, countries were fighting wars over salt mines. If you had a salt mine and your neighbor didn't, it was a very big deal. With the coming of the electric grids, people discovered refrigeration and freezing. Meat that had been frozen and thawed not only tasted a lot better than meat that had been soaked in salt brine, but it was cheaper. Cheaper and better. Salt, in a very few years, had its monopoly ended, and it didn't end our use of salt. In Washington, D.C. this February, we needed quite a bit to put on sidewalks. Tastes good on corn on the cob. There are lots of reasons to have salt. But nobody lords it over his neighbor anymore because he has salt and the neighbor doesn't. You'll go to lunch today, there'll be salt shakers on tables. I doubt if any of you is going to look at those and say, I wonder where that comes from. I wonder if we're salt independent. No, salt's boring. Unless you're Long and Morton's, salt's boring. It's what we need to do to oil. Make it boring. Thank you.